The first topic I'd like to address relates to the ongoing occupation of Gaza and the West Bank by Israel. In particular, it looks at the claim that Israel is, quote unquote, the chosen people of God, and even what that phrase really means. So let's dive in. We are all encouraged to read the Bible as Christians. St. Jerome is quoted as saying, "Ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of God." But the Bible is not an easy read. It is filled with stories of murder, deceit, and betrayal. It sometimes seems to show God as having favorites, and sometimes even commanding one nation to wage war on another, and to do the most cruel things in His name. Honestly, some parts of the Old Testament are very challenging to read, and to still believe in the loving God that Jesus proclaimed and demonstrated. After all of this, how does it relate to the topic? Well, it relates to the Jewish belief that God has given them the right to occupy and own certain lands inhabited by others. It claims that God is always on their side in any war, and that He favors them above all others, and have destined them to be a great nation, unique among all others because of their faith in Him. I really struggle with some of these passages in Scripture, in particular Deuteronomy and the book of Joshua, since so much of it seems to contradict the message of Jesus revealed in the New Testament. It is a long-standing tradition and belief in our faith that all Scripture is inspired and useful for instruction and increasing our faith. But on the other hand, we must remember that the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, was written by Jews, about Jews, and for a Jewish audience. It is inherently biased. The idea that the Jews are special to God above others is an obvious lie propagated by them over the years. Why do I say that? Well, St. Peter in the Acts 10 verses 34 to 38 explains clearly that God does not have favorites. Rather, that in every nation, whoever fears God and acts rightly and uprightly is acceptable to Him. Jesus Himself consistently made Gentiles, particularly the Samaritans, the heroes of His story, to show that He puts no regard on being Jewish when it comes to being acceptable to God. The Catechism, that is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, gives us a guide as to how we should read and understand Scripture. It explains that we must read it with three things in mind. First, the content and unity of all Scripture. That is, Scripture does not contradict itself. It is one story, the story of our salvation from sin through God's free gift of His incarnation. 2. The living tradition of the Church. As St. John affirms at the end of his Gospel, Jesus did and taught much more than can be written. Remember, for 40 days after His resurrection, until His ascension, Jesus stayed with His disciples, teaching them away from the public eye. The living tradition of the Church has been passed on unbroken from these apostolic times. Thirdly, we must think of how the passage fits into the whole plan of salvation. As I said, the Bible is one story, that of mankind's salvation, and it must be read with this theme in mind always. It is clear that God had to choose a specific time and a place to incarnate. After all, he was entering human existence, bounded by time and space. Why he chose Abraham so many years ago, we can't know. Maybe it was because he was just a nomad with an unswerving trust in him. Remember, there was no tribe of Israel at the time. The story of salvation, as written in the Bible, is that it was God's intention to guide the descendants of Abraham to become a nation with a monotheistic understanding of him different from the other nations at the time, so that when the time came for him to incarnate, he would be welcomed, listened to, and followed, and to spread his message of love and a clear understanding of who he is throughout the entire world. In this sense, and in this sense only, were the Jews, like the Christians, chosen. They were chosen to bring a new understanding of God to the world, and to complete this by following and becoming disciples of his son, Jesus. Jesus himself started his mission clearly stating that he came specifically to the Jews. And when he sent his apostles out 2 by 2, he again specifically told them they were to go to the Jews only. Of course, the message spread to others, non-Jews, even without their direct work. And of course, many Jewish leaders did not accept their message. So there was a schism. Those who believed Jesus and followed him, who eventually became known as Christians, and those who rejected him and preferred their old, narrow, and biased understanding. So, God's plan was that all Jews would follow Jesus. But as happened throughout the Old Testament, some accepted and followed God's plan and some rejected it. So what's this all about? The point is that Jesus came as a fulfillment of all of the Old Testament's prophecies and promises. The Gospel of Matthew in particular is aimed at showing that very fact. But all the other Gospels do as well. The whole point is that if we believe Jesus is God incarnate, that he came to free all mankind from the slavery of sin, if Jesus is the one all the prophets wrote about, and he is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, then logically, when the Old Testament speaks about promises to Abraham's descendants, that the entire world will be blessed through them, it cannot be referring to the remnant of Judaism who rejected Jesus as God, who put him to death and continue to hold to practices and teachings that are rooted in one ethnic group only. When God promised Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars and the sand, and that all nations would be blessed by them, he was not talking about the state of Israel as it is today, with only 9 million followers, or any particular country or ethnic group for that matter. He was talking about those who would follow Jesus, his chosen descendant, who would bring a fresh understanding to the world, and yet an understanding that was prophesied for many years. So in summary, we must read the Bible through Christian eyes, because it was written for Christians, not Jews. Because it is the story of the salvation of mankind through Jesus, and we must understand all of it in this context. Thank you.